Get her off my stage. She's mute. She'll ruin this marble. That was all it took. One public insult from a famous sculptor, and the world almost missed a miracle. A quiet female veteran, mute, mocked in front of a crowd, said nothing in return. She simply sat at the sculpting stand, and when her hands touched the clay, the world held its breath. What followed wasn't just art. It was a movement. This is the unforgettable story of how a woman with no voice, no fame, and no stage gave humanity something it had forgotten how to do. For decades, the prestigious Blackwood Art Institute had been a beacon of classical artistry, but also a fortress of silent judgment. Reno Stone Reynolds, a 68-year-old retired Marine Corps officer, now a revered sculpture mentor at the Institute, carried her own silent burden. An old injury from an explosion had damaged her throat, leaving her voice a low, gravelly rasp, often unintelligible. She relied on sign language or writing to communicate, a quiet existence often misunderstood. Yet, her steady gaze and hands, calloused from years of service and shaping clay, radiated an unspoken wisdom. This week, the annual grand exhibit loomed, promising to showcase the Institute's elite talent. Keep her away from the valuable pieces. This isn't a charity exhibit. The voice cracked through the grand exhibition hall like a whip, arrogant and sharp, slicing through the gentle hum of pre-show chatter. Gasps fluttered across the room as heads turned. At the center of it all, beneath the harsh glow of a crystal chandelier, a young woman stood motionless. She held a small, worn sketchpad loosely in one hand, her other hovering inches above the polished surface of a grand marble sculpture. She did not flinch. She did not speak, but something in the set of her chin, delicate and steady, refused to yield. The man who had spoken, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, stepped forward. Victor Sorensen, a name etched into modern sculpture history, the kind of artist who could command rooms with a single, perfectly rendered form. His silver hair and icy blue eyes radiated command. People bowed when he entered spaces like this. His hands were insured for millions. And now those same hands pointed down dismissively at the woman before him. She doesn't belong near that work, he said, half to the stage manager, half to the dozens of elite guests already seated. She's mute, for heaven's sake. She'll damage it. Sir, came a tentative voice from behind a velvet rope. She just asked to feel the texture. She's not even scheduled to. I don't care. Victor barked. You don't let a child play with antique ceramics just because she wants to touch them. Get her away from my exhibit. The woman still hadn't moved, her eyes, though expressive, stared somewhere just past the sculpture. She looked younger than she was, in her mid-20s, perhaps. But something about her presence defied fragility. Though her body was small and slender, her hands were elegant and long, the hands of someone meant to create form. I'm sorry, she signed quietly, her hands moving with a fluid grace. Her gestures floated across the stage like leaves on still water. No need to be dramatic, Victor replied coldly, already turning his back. The world has enough pity stories. From the wings, someone recorded. Reno, half hidden in the shadows, phone halfway in her coat pocket. She hadn't meant to film, not really, but something about the woman's stillness made her thumb press record almost involuntarily. The woman stepped back, placing her sketchpad in front of her again. There was no shaking in her hands, no moisture in her eyes. The hush in the room deepened. Not respectful silence, but that uncomfortable, sticky quiet that follows cruelty in public. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. A few whispered. Then she turned and walked away. Nobody knew her name. Not yet. 2 years earlier, Ella Brighton had been just another invisible figure in the marble-lined corridors of Blackwood Art Institute, the kind of place where students' surnames mattered more than their talents. Most students came from generational wealth, ambassadors' children, retired art legends' sons and daughters of global curators. Ella came with nothing. No mother, no father, just a plain case worker who dropped her off at the campus gate and a single suitcase filled with threadbare clothes, a well-used set of sculpting tools, and a half-broken braille reader. The institute didn't technically admit her. She was there under a program called Silent Observer, a euphemism for keeping her far from main studios or classrooms, but allowing her to soak up the inspiration. She soaked it up all right, from outside practice rooms through doors left ajar, from vibrations in the floorboards when sculptors worked upstairs. She spent her afternoons sitting cross-legged in the hallway outside Professor Albright's lecture room, tracing forms with her fingers in the air, every muscle in her hands twitching with invisible cords. It was Reno, the retired Marine Corps officer and former sculpture professor now acting as an institute advisor due to her vocal injury, who first noticed. At first, she dismissed it as a coincidence. But one evening, as the rain poured so loudly on the institute's arched glass roof that even practice became impossible, she saw Ella sitting there, hands suspended mid-air, eyes closed, following a silent rhythm. Reno, her own voice a rough whisper, tried to speak. When Ella couldn't understand, Reno pulled out a notepad and pen, then resorted to sign language. "Are you mimicking my lecture?" Reno signed. "I was trying," Ella signed back, her hands moving swiftly. "I'm sorry." "For what?" Reno signed. Ella hesitated. "For being here." Reno's gaze softened. The hallway smelled of old stone and varnished wood. Thunder rumbled outside. "Don't be sorry, be precise," Reno signed. From that day forward, when her students had gone and the lights dimmed low, Reno stayed behind. She taught Ella not with verbal lectures, but with stories conveyed through sign language and written notes, describing the way a sculpture should feel like a captured emotion, or how a portrait could be a whispered secret. She pressed Ella's fingers into clay to explain the weight of a form, tapped out rhythms on her knuckles to convey flow, hummed tones into her ear until Ella could feel pitch without hearing it. And Ella absorbed everything with terrifying speed. But talent in a place like Blackwood was not enough. When the Institute announced its Young Virtuoso Showcase, Reno filled out the application for Ella herself. She didn't list her disability. She listed her name, her skill, and a private recommendation so glowing it bordered on a prayer. Ella was allowed to audition. Technically, her assigned time slot was 7:45 a.m., before most faculty had even arrived. The clay she was told to use was basic, not the fine European blend. A single judge came to observe. No audience, no welcome. Ella sat in silence for a long time before placing her hands on the clay. When she began to sculpt, Ella didn't just reproduce forms. She summoned them, transformed them. The piece, a monumental, abstract representation of resilience, rose from the clay like a living thing, massive, aching, and unspeakably tender. When she was done, the judge nodded curtly and left without a word. She never received a call back, and Ella disappeared from the Institute's halls. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that someone had been watching. The janitor, who cleaned the wing every morning, had paused outside the door. He had seen what the judge saw, but unlike the judge, he was moved. That night, he uploaded the video he'd quietly taken, titled it, "Mute Girl Rejected by Institute Creates Masterpiece from the Heart." The video didn't explode immediately, but a few days later, an art blogger in Berlin reposted it. Then a curator in Argentina, then a retired critic in Brooklyn. The shares tripled by the hour. Comments poured in from every continent. "Her work plays like she's telling her own story," one wrote. "I felt that in my chest." The Institute board panicked. Not publicly, but behind closed doors, furious meetings were held. One particularly nervous administrator asked if they could track her IP address. Another reminded them that she didn't have an IP address. She didn't even own a phone. She was unreachable, until she wasn't. An envelope arrived at the Institute's front desk. Hand-delivered, gilded edges from the International Gala of Human Harmony. A global art exhibition broadcast to over 60 countries. This year's theme, breaking barriers and form. They wanted Ella Brighton to open the show. The dean choked on his espresso. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. A spotlight had been cast, and for the first time, Ella was no longer a hidden shadow in the back hallway. She would share the same stage as Victor Sorensen himself. And Victor did not take the news well. "She'll ruin the program's integrity." Victor's voice was low, calm, almost pleasant, too calm, the way a winter wind can be quiet right before it bites. He spoke to the gala's director, an elderly man named Gerard Morrow, whose career had spanned every corner of global art diplomacy. The two were standing near the edge of the main hall during a pre-rehearsal walkthrough in Vienna's Grand Harmony Hall. "She's a child, mute, untrained. It's political. You know it is." Gerard raised an eyebrow. His French-accented voice carried just enough steel to remind Victor he wasn't speaking to a sycophant. "And yet, the world is waiting to experience her work. Or haven't you seen the numbers?" Victor exhaled sharp and slow. "This isn't a talent show." "No," Gerard replied, smiling faintly. "It's a reckoning." Somewhere across the city, Ella Brighton stood barefoot in the quiet of her hotel suite. The floor beneath her toes was cool marble, veined like river branches frozen in time. She tilted her head slightly as she listened to the wind against the window, then to the silence between the gusts. Even in unfamiliar cities, she mapped her world through touch and subtle vibrations, the low rumble of distant traffic, the high-pitched hum of a faulty elevator 2 floors above, the tiny irregular tapping of a tree branch against the glass. It all fit together like an unspoken blueprint. Reno had flown with her despite no longer holding any official title. She refused to leave Ella's side even when the Institute tried to replace her with a flashy manager. "You know," Reno had signed during the flight, her hands moving with rough affection, "in all my years, I never imagined I'd be flying across the world with the finest sculptor I ever taught, and one the school never officially admitted." Ella smiled softly. "They admitted my footsteps." "That's something," Reno chuckled. "You always did create with a quiet kind of defiance." The rehearsal was scheduled for the following afternoon. Ella had not yet touched any fine marble since the day she'd walked off that institute stage. She hadn't dared, not because of fear, but because something inside her had shifted. Sculpting used to be her escape, her way of folding the world into form when life refused to be kind. But now the world wanted to witness. Not as background art, not as indulgence, as truth. And the weight of that was immense. Still, when the moment came, when the doors to the rehearsal hall opened and the spotlight swept down from the rafters like a blade of light, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward calmly with Reno at her side until her hands brushed the edge of the sculpting stand. It was the same make she'd always dreamed of, a pristine Carrara marble block, waiting to be shaped. The surface was cold, smooth, untouched. Her fingers trembled just for a moment, then fell still, and then she sat. Every sound in the hall retreated. Even the dust seemed to pause. She placed her hands on the clay, but she didn't sculpt. She simply held the silence in her palms, stretching it, commanding it until it bent to her. And then, with a breath so quiet it barely belonged to her, she began. The forms that emerged weren't from any known school or style. They didn't follow a familiar pattern. No famous sculptor had etched them centuries ago. They were hers, raw, unsketched, born in that exact moment. A blend of memory and invention. She began with a single sustained curve, soft, uncertain, like a child reaching into a dark room. Then a ripple of textures down the right hand, followed by a broken line progression that sounded like sunlight filtered through grief. The left hand moved slowly, deliberately, more felt than seen. Those present, technicians, ushers, even the man fixing a rigging cable, stood frozen. No one gave a cue. No one dared to interrupt. Even Victor, standing near the wings, had stopped mid-sentence when her hands began to move. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed. There was something haunting about it, something unsettling. She's not reading from anything, he thought. Not even muscle memory. This is pure invention. No one creates like this without being broken first. And then it dawned on him. She wasn't broken. He was. The form morphed. A sudden shift. Minor details now. Melancholy lines rising in wounded defiance. Her body leaned forward slightly as if pulled by invisible threads. Her face was serene, not joyful, not pained, just open like a door left ajar during a storm. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-form. Her hands hovered. No resolution, no applause, just silence. And that silence thundered through the chamber like the aftermath of war. The rehearsal director stepped forward, stunned. "Ms. Brighton, will that be your piece for the gala?" She tilted her head, considering. She signed, "No, that was just a warm-up." Victor clenched his jaw. The next day, the gala director received a request from Victor Sorensen's agent. He wanted to change the performance order. Victor no longer wished to follow Ella's set. He wanted to open instead. The request was denied. Meanwhile, news of Ella's rehearsal leaked. Somehow, someone had taken a short video clip on their phone and posted it to an art forum. The clip, just 45 seconds long, was shared over 3 million times in 12 hours. Headlines followed: "The mute virtuoso who sculpted without sight." "The girl who silenced an art hall." "Rodin reincarnated." "No. Brighton begins." Victor spent the night in restless pacing. Not out of jealousy, not exactly, but fear. Not of her, but of something deeper, of irrelevance, of watching his legacy get eclipsed not by time, but by a woman who created with a kind of purity he hadn't touched in decades. He hadn't created from truth in so long he'd forgotten what it felt like. And now all he had was perfection. She had something else. On the morning of the gala, the Grand Harmonique Hall buzzed like a beehive of silk and diamonds. Diplomats, royalty, philanthropists, critics, and collectors filled every velvet seat. The pedestals stood empty beneath golden archways. Cameras were locked in. Backstage, Victor warmed up alone. His hands worked over a small clay model with practiced flair. Every line exact, every curve obeyed. He didn't realize that just one room over, Ella sat with her hands on her lap, doing nothing but breathing, listening, mapping the resonance of the exhibition hall by its breathing. Feeling the vibrations from the floor as the audience shuffled in. She didn't need sound. She could feel the weight of thousands. Reno stood beside her quietly, holding her small sculpting tool. "Are you afraid?" Reno signed softly. Ella shook her head gently. She signed, "No. I've already sculpted my hardest piece. This one is just truth." Reno smiled. She signed, "Then give it to them." Ella nodded, then stood. A stage hand opened the side curtain. It was time. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the opulent auditorium. "Please welcome to the stage, Ella Brighton." A ripple of curiosity ran through the audience. Some leaned forward, brows raised, others tilted their heads toward their programs, flipping pages to find the unfamiliar name. A few whispered to their neighbors. Most had never heard of her. Those who had seen the viral video from weeks before now sat motionless, anticipation bubbling under their skin like a drawn breath that couldn't be released. The house lights dimmed. A single beam of warm gold spilled down from the rafters onto the stage, illuminating the pristine Carrara marble block that stood like a monolith of potential, waiting to be awakened. And then she appeared. Not in a dramatic entrance, no fanfare, no sweeping gown, just Ella. Barefoot in a simple black gown, one hand gently resting on Reno's arm, the other loosely holding her small sculpting tool. The audience watched in reverent silence as she approached the marble. Her steps slow, deliberate, but without a hint of fear. Her head turned slightly as she counted the spacing. Reno guided her gently to the sculpting stand, then stepped back into the shadows like a guardian who had fulfilled her purpose. Ella sat for a moment. She didn't move. Her hands lay in her lap and her head bowed, not in submission, but in communion, like an artisan before their craft, or a warrior before the battle. The silence became sacred. And then, barely audible, she inhaled. Her fingers rose and hovered, and they began to work. But what emerged wasn't a recognizable form. Not classical, not modern, not abstract. No one in the audience could name it because it had no name. It was something else. Something older than blueprints, deeper than memory. It was a story. Her right hand fluttered in ripples across the upper surface, delicate gestures that danced like fingertips over glass. They were playful, hesitant, childlike. Her left hand joined a moment later, slow and rich, anchoring the form with the gravity of a father's absence, a mother's silent strength. Those in the audience who had seen hardship felt it instantly, the trembling start, the line stumbling, searching, then suddenly finding clarity. A rising curve that soared briefly triumphant, then collapsed again into fragmented forms that sounded like unanswered prayers. It was not a performance, it was remembrance. A sigh from the front row broke the air. An ambassador's wife dabbed her cheek with the corner of her glove. A young architect in the balcony leaned so far forward that his glasses fell from his face and clattered onto the floor below. But no one shushed him. No one moved because now Ella's tempo shifted. The forms thickened. Her fingers struck the clay with unexpected power. Percussive bursts that thundered like fists pounding against a locked door. Her entire body moved with the form. Shoulders tight, spine bowed. The rhythm became defiant, angry, alive. This was no longer just memory. It was resistance. The art seemed to cry out, I was never given a chance. You looked past me. You shut your doors, but I am still here. Each crescendo struck like a confession. Each diminuendo left a vacuum, drawing the crowd in closer. Even Victor, watching from the green room through a live monitor, had frozen mid-step. He had one hand on the tuning keys of his own sculpting stand, but he wasn't touching them now. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes narrowed. She had no blueprint, no assistant, no model, and yet she commanded every soul in the room like a master. Halfway through the piece, Ella slowed. Her left hand dropped out entirely, and with her right, she began a single form, a simple, wistful sequence in flowing lines. It drifted upward, climbing as if trying to touch the stars. She repeated it once, twice, and then she changed it just slightly. A single curve bent downward, another skipped entirely, and suddenly those listening understood this was her mother's embrace, her father's silent strength. Untrained eyes couldn't tell. But those with childhoods full of soft comfort, of gentle rocking under moonlight, recognized it at once, and it shattered them. The forms softened. The hall was utterly still. Ella held the final curve so lightly it was almost a breath, then released it into nothing. No motion, no bow. She sat with her hands on her knees, facing the audience without seeing them, but knowing exactly what she'd left in their chests. And then the thunder came. Applause erupted like a dam bursting. It wasn't polite. It was primal. Chairs scraped backward. Some stood, others shouted. There were tears in places that had not known weeping in decades. The ovation rolled like a wave, sweeping the room in a fever of awe and disbelief. Cameras panned from face to face. Critics, curators, heads of state, each with expressions torn wide open. A voice cried from the balcony, encore. Another followed, Ella. Ella. She didn't rise. She didn't react. She simply turned her face upward toward the lights as if listening to the sound, not with her ears, but with her skin. Backstage, Victor turned from the monitor and poured himself a drink with shaking hands. They won't remember me tonight, he muttered. They'll remember her. He wasn't wrong. In the hours that followed, the gala's live stream shattered viewership records. News outlets scrambled for a name. Social media exploded with clips, commentary, tributes. Sculptors posted reaction videos. Critics published emergency editorials calling her performance a once-in-a-century expression of the human spirit. By morning, Ella Brighton's name was the top trending search in over 20 countries, and she had no idea. In her quiet hotel room, far from the glow of fame, Ella sat cross-legged on the carpet, her hands resting in her lap. Reno sat across from her, her cup of tea untouched. Was it enough? Ella signed softly. Reno leaned forward, her voice low and reverent. You didn't just sculpt art, Ella. You changed its shape. Ella tilted her head. She signed, but I didn't finish the story. Reno smiled. She signed, no, because now the world will be asking for more. Ella Brighton. The voice was nervous, breathless, as the man jogged down the marble hallway toward her. She had only just stepped into the side exit of the exhibition hall, the last embers of applause still echoing faintly in the air behind her. Her small sculpting tool tapped softly against the ground as she paused, turning her head slightly. Reno, ever at her side, stepped forward instinctively to shield her, but the man stopped a few respectful feet away. My name's Anthony Liu, he said. I'm with Harmonique Art Records. We just saw your performance, and I don't even have words. Ella nodded slowly. She heard his heartbeat in his throat, fast, honest, not rehearsed. I don't know what your management situation is, he stammered, but we'd like to discuss signing you. Global tour. Exclusive rights to produce your first studio collection. Anything you want. Name it. Ella said nothing. Her fingers quietly twisted the thin silk tassel on the end of her sculpting tool. The wind moved faintly through the corridor's stained glass windows. Reno raised her hand gently. She signed, she'll speak when she's ready. And she did. But it wasn't the answer expected. She signed, do you know what the word prelude means? Anthony blinked. It means, well, the beginning, right? Ella signed, it means an introduction to something larger, something that hasn't happened yet. She turned her head back toward the echoing auditorium behind them. Tonight wasn't the story. It was just the prelude. The man stood frozen, his business card slipping slightly in his hand, forgotten. By the next morning, a flurry of other offers followed, every gallery, every art house. Private invitations from cultural ministries, royal patrons, heads of major institutes. Some offered money, others offered entire exhibition halls in her name. And yet Ella answered none of them. She sat with Reno on the train to an art retreat deep in the Alps, where a quiet sanctuary awaited her. She requested a cabin with no screens, no sound-canceling insulation, only windows that opened so she could feel the wind and the passing countryside. As the landscape rolled by, she pressed her palm against the glass and signed, they want me to sculpt forms I haven't lived yet. Reno smiled faintly. She signed, you've always sculpted from your scars, but now maybe it's time to sculpt from your healing. Back at the Institute, Victor Sorensen remained behind. He had not spoken publicly since the gala. His agent issued a carefully worded statement about artistic reflection and respecting new voices in the sculptural world. But behind the scenes, Victor sat in the masterclass wing watching replays of Ella's performance on an old analog monitor. The digital buffer removed so he could rewind by feel. He didn't speak as he watched. He only listened over and over again. And each time a different line stabbed deeper. Because there were things Ella sculpted that he'd once understood. Before the fame, before the pressure, before the perfection, before every curve had to be clean and every smile timed to curtain calls, he had forgotten how to bleed into the clay. Ella hadn't. She'd never had a choice. The Institute scrambled to rewrite its policies. Donations poured in with conditions: create accessible programs, open silent auditions, fund scholarships for non-traditional students. What had been a hidden rot in their culture was now a cracked open wound bleeding into the public. And Ella, she was silent. Weeks passed. The offers kept coming. One morning, Reno found her at a small clay wheel in the village cafe near their Alps retreat, sculpting for no one in particular. A child sat cross-legged nearby, tracing the floor tiles with a toy car. An old man read the newspaper, not even realizing who she was. She sculpted anyway, not for applause, not for gallery deals, but for the story. A reporter tracked her down eventually. Young, persistent, respectful. She asked Ella if she could record a short segment for a documentary. Ella hesitated, but agreed. Only if they filmed the clay, not her face. She signed, "I don't want this to be about me. I want people to feel themselves in the art." "But your story matters," the reporter insisted. "You've broken barriers." Ella smiled gently. She signed, "No, I've just reminded people that silence doesn't mean absence." That clip alone garnered 10 million views. Among those who saw it was a teenage girl in rural Texas, deaf since birth, who had always been told art wasn't for her. After watching Ella, she began experimenting with haptic sculpting gloves, mapping form through touch. She sent Ella a letter written in Braille with the help of her sister. It ended with, "You made space for me." Ella held the letter for a long time. Then, for the first time since the gala, she sat to compose again. The new piece came to her, not in a storm, but in a whisper. It began with a simple phrase, 3 gestures, no more, repeated with minor variation. She built around it slowly, layering textures like vines curling around a trellis. This time, it was not sorrowful, nor angry, nor desperate. It was thankful. When she sculpted it for Reno, Reno closed her eyes halfway through and turned her face away, not to hide tears, but to honor the moment. "You've sculpted a bridge," Reno signed softly when she finished. Ella looked puzzled. Reno signed, "A bridge between who you were and who you've become." She titled the piece Sightlines. It was exhibited for the first time in a modest chamber gallery in Paris, not announced in advance, just a quiet showing for 100 guests. No live stream, no press, just form. And those who were lucky enough to be there never forgot it. They said it felt like finding a path in the dark and realizing you had known the way all along.